Good evening. My name is Joseph Sippets, and it's time for another of our Saturday night stories with SJCPL. And today I've chosen to read a story from the book A Long Way from Chicago. Sorry about the glare. It's written by Richard Peck. It was a National Book Award finalist. Um, and it was written for a younger audience, but I think it's perfectly enjoyable for old farts like myself. So, without further ado, this is the first chapter of the book, and it's called Shotgun Cheatum's Last Night Above Ground, 1929. You wouldn't think we'd have to leave Chicago to see a dead body. We were growing up there back in the bad old days of Al Capone and Bugs Moran, just the winter before they'd had the St. Valentine's Day massacre over on North Clark Street. The city had such an evil reputation that the Thompson submachine gun was better known as the Chicago typewriter. But I'd grown to the age of 9, and my sister Mary Alice was 7, and we'd yet to see a stiff. We guessed that most of them were where you couldn't see them at the bottom of Lake Michigan, wearing concrete overshoes. No, we had to travel all the way down to our Grandma Dowdall's before we ever set eyes on a corpse. Dad said Mary Alice and I were getting of the age where we could travel on our own. He said it was time we spent a week with Grandma, who was getting on in years. We hadn't seen anything of her since we were tykes. Being Chicago people, Mother and Dad didn't have a car, and Grandma certainly wasn't on the telephone. They're dumping us on her is what they're doing, Mary Alice said darkly. She suspected that Mother and Dad would take off for a week of fishing up in Wisconsin in our absence. I didn't mind going because we went on the train, the Wabash Railroad's crack Bluebird that left Dearborn Station every morning bound for St. Louis. Grandma lived somewhere in between, in one of those towns the railroad tracks cut in two. People stood out on their porches to see the train go through. Mary Alice said she couldn't stand the place. For one thing, at Grandma's you had to go outside to the privy. It stood just across from the Cobb house, a tumble-down shed full of stuff left there in Grandpa Dowdall's time. A big old snaggle-toothed tomcat lived in the Cobb house, and as quick as you'd come out of the privy, he'd jump at you. Mary Alice hated that. Mary Alice said there was nothing to do and nobody to do it with, so she'd tag after me, though I was 2 years older and a boy. We'd stroll downtown or uptown in those first days. It was only a short block of brick buildings, the bank, the insurance company, Moore's store, the Coffee Pot Cafe, where the old saloon had stood. Prohibition was on in those days, which meant that selling liquor was against the law, so people made their own beer at home. They still had tin roofs out over the sidewalk and hitching rails. Most farmers came to town horse-drawn, though there were Fords, and the banker, L.J. Wadebeck, drove a Hupmobile. It looked like a slow place to us, but that was before they buried Shotgun Cheatum. He might have made it unnoticed all the way to the grave except for his name. The county seat newspaper didn't want to run an obituary on anybody called Shotgun, but nobody knew any other name for him. This sparked attention from some of the bigger newspapers. One sent in a stringer to nose around the Coffee Pot Cafe for human interest story, since it was August, the slow month for news. The Coffee Pot was where people went to loaf, talk, tall, and swap gossip. Mary Alice and I were of some interest when we dropped by because we were kin of Mrs. Dowdall's, who had never set foot in the place. She said she liked to keep herself to herself, which was uphill work in a town like that. Mary Alice and I carried the tale home that a suspicious type had come off the train in citified clothes and a stiff straw hat. He stuck out a mile and was asking around about Shotgun Cheatum, and he was taking notes. Grandma had already heard it on the grapevine that Shotgun was no more, though she wasn't the first person people ran to with news. She wasn't what you'd call a popular woman. Grandma Dowdall, who had been well thought of, but Grandpa Dowdall had been well thought of, but he was long gone. That was the day she was working tomatoes on the Black Iron Range, and her kitchen was hot enough to steam the calendars off the wall. Her sleeves were turned back on her big arms when she heard the town was apt to fill up with newspaper reporters. Her jaw clenched. Presently, she said, I'll tell you what the reporter's after. He wants to go the horse laugh on us because he thinks we're nothing but a bunch of hayseeds and no-count country people. We are, but what business of that is his? Who was Shotgun Cheatum anyway? Mary Alice asked. He was just an old reprobate who lived poor and died broke, Grandma said. Nobody went near him because he smelled like a polecat. He lived in the chicken coop, and now they'll have to burn it down. To change the subject, she said to me, Here, you stir these tomatoes. Don't let them stick. I've stood in this heat for long enough until I'm half cooked myself. I didn't like kitchen work. Yesterday she'd done apple butter, and that hadn't been too bad. She'd made that outdoors over an open fire, and she put pennies in the cauldron to keep it from sticking. Down at the coffee pot, they say Shotgun rode with the James boys. Which James boys? Grandma asked. Jesse James, I said, and Frank. They wouldn't have had him, she said. Anyhow, them Jameses are Missouri people. And they were telling that reporter Shotgun had killed a man and went to the penitentiary. Several around here have done that, Grandma said, though I don't recall him ever being out of town for any length of time. Who's doing all this talking? A real old humped-over lady with buck teeth, Mary Alice said. Cross-eyed? Grandma said. That'd be Effie Wilcox. You'd think she's ugly now. You should have seen her as a girl. And she'd talk you to death. Her tongue's attached in the middle and flaps at both ends. Grandma's over by the screen door for a breath of fresh air. They said he'd notched his gun in 6 places, I said, pushing my luck. They said the notches were either for banks he'd robbed or for sheriffs he'd shot. Was that Effie again? Never trust an ugly woman. She's got a grudge against the world, said Grandma, who was no oil painting herself. She fetched up a sigh. I'll tell you how Shotgun got his name. He wasn't but about 10 years old, and he went out to shoot quail with a bunch of older boys. He couldn't hit the barn wall from the inside, and he had a sty in one eye. They were out there in the pasture without a quail in sight, but Shotgun got all excited about being with the big boys. He squeezed off a round and killed a cow. Down she went. If he'd been aiming at her, she'd have died of old age eventually. The boys took the gun off him, not knowing who he'd plug next. That's how he got his name, and it stuck to him like flypaper. Any girl in town could have outshot him, and that includes me. She kept a 12-gauge double-barreled Winchester Model 21 behind the woodbox, but we figured it had been Grandpa Dowdle's for shooting ducks. And I wasn't no Annie Oakley myself, except with squirrels, Grandma, who was still at the door fanning her apron. Then in the same voice she said, Looks like we got company. Take them tomatoes off the fire. A stranger was on the porch, and when Mary Alice and I crowded up behind Grandma to see, it was the reporter. He was sharp-faced, and he'd sweated through his hatband. What's your business? Grandma said through the screen wire, which was as friendly as she got. Ma'am, I'm here making inquiries about the late Shotgun Cheatum. He shuffled his feet, wanting to get one of them feet in the door. Then he mopped up his hat brim with his silk handkerchief. His Masonic ring had a diamond chip in it. Who sent you to me? I'm going door to door, ma'am. You should know how you ladies like to talk. Bless your hearts. You'd all talk the hind leg off a mule. Mary Alice and I both stared at that. We figured Grandma might grab the broom and swat him off the porch. We'd already seen how she could make short work of peddlers, even when they weren't lippy, and tramps didn't seem to mark her fence post. We suspected that you didn't get inside her house unless she knew you, but to our surprise, she swept open the screen door and stepped out onto the porch. I followed. So did Mary Alice, once she was sure the snaggletooth tomcat wasn't lurking out there waiting to pounce. You're a newspaper reporter? She said. Peoria? It was the flashy closed, but he looked surprised. What have they been telling you? Looks like I got a good story by the tail, he said. Last of the old owl hoot gunslingers goes to a pauper's grave. That kind of angle, ma'am. I wonder if you might help me flesh out the story some. Well, I got flesh to spare, Grandma said mildly. Who's been talking to you? It was mainly an elderly lady. Ugly as sin, calls herself Wilcox, Grandma said. She's been in a state hospital for the insane until just here lately, but as a reporter, I guess you knows that out. Mary Alice nudged me hard, and the reporter's eyes widened. They tell you how Shotgun come by his name? Opinions vary, ma'am. Ah, well, fame is fleeting, Grandma said. He got it in the Civil War. The reporter's hand hovered over his breast pocket where a notepad stuck out. Oh yes, Shotgun went right through the war with the Illinois Volunteers. Shiloh, in the spring of '62, he was with U.S. Grant when Vicksburg fell. That's when he got his name. Grant gave it to him. In fact, Shotgun didn't hold with government-issued firearms. He shot rebels with his old Remington pump action that he used to kill quail back here at home. Now, Mary Alice was yanking on my shirt tail. We knew kids lie all the time, but Grandma was no kid, but she could tell some whoppers. Of course, the reporter had been lied to big time at the cafe, but Grandma's lies were more interesting, even historical. They made Shotgun look better while they left Effie Wilcox in the dust. He was always a crack shot, she said, winding down. Come home from the war with a line of medals bigger than his chest. And yet he died penniless, the reporter said in a thoughtful voice. Oh, well, he'd sold off all them medals and gave the money to war widows and orphans. A change crossed the reporter's narrow face. Shotgun had gone from a kill-crazy gunslinger to a war hero marksman. Philanthropist, even. He'd fumbled his notepad out and was scribbling. He thought he'd hit pay dirt with Grandma. It's all a matter of record, she said. You could look it up. He was ready to wire in a news story. Civil War hero, handpicked by U.S. Grant, called to the great campground in the sky. Something like that. And he never married? Never did, Grandma said. He broke Effie Wilcox's heart, and she's bitter still, as you see. And now he goes to a pauper's grave with none to mark his passing, the reporter said, which may have been a sample of his writing style. They tell you that, Grandma said? They're pulling your leg, sonny. You drop by the coffee pot and tell them you heard that Shotgun's being buried from my house with full honors. He'll spend his last night above ground in my front room, and you're invited. The reporter backed down the porch stairs, staggered under all this new material. Much obliged, ma'am, he said. Happy to help, Grandma said. Mary Alice had turned loose at my short shirt tail. What little we knew about grown-ups didn't seem to cover Grandma. She turned on us. Now I've got to change my shoes and walk all the way up to the lumber yard in this heat, she said, as if she hadn't brought it on all herself. Up at the lumber yard, they'll be knocking together Shotgun Cheatum's coffin and sending the bills to the county. And Grandma had to tell them to bring the coffin to her house with Shotgun in it. By nightfall, a green pine coffin stood on two sawhorses in the bay window of the front room, and people milled about in the yard. They couldn't see Shotgun from there because the coffin lid blocked the view. Beside, the heavy gauze hung from the open lid and down over the front of the coffin to veil him. Shotgun hadn't been exactly fresh when they discovered his body. Grandma had flung open every window, but there was a peculiar smell in the room. I'd only had one look at him when they carried in the coffin, and that was enough. I'll tell you just two things about him. He didn't have his teeth in, and he was wearing bib overalls. The people in the yard still couldn't believe Grandma was holding open house. This didn't stop the reporter from haunting the parlor, looking for more flesh to add to his story, and it didn't stop Mrs. L.J. Waiterbach, the banker's wife, who came leading her father, an ancient codger, half her size, in full Civil War Union blue. We're here to pay our respects at this sad time, Mrs. Weidenbach said when Grandma let them in. When I told Daddy that Shotgun had been decorated by U.S. Grant and wounded 3 times at Bull Run, it had brought it all back to him, and we had to come. Her old daddy wore a forage cap and a decoration from the Grand Army of the Republic, and he seemed to have no idea where he was. She led him up to the coffin where they admired the flowers. Grandma had planted a pitcher of glads from her garden at either end of the pine box. In each pitcher, she'd stuck an American flag. A few more people were willing to brave Grandma, and they came up and went, but Soon we were down to the reporter, who'd settled in the best chair, still nosing for news. Then appeared at the front door, but was Miss Effie Wilcox in a hat. "Mrs. Dowdle, I've come to set with you overnight and see our brave old soldier through his last watch." In those days, people sat up with a corpse through the final night before burial. I'd have bet money Grandma wouldn't let Mrs. Wilcox in for a quick look, let alone overnight. But of course Grandma was putting on the best show possible to pull the wool over the reporter's eyes. Little though she seemed to think of townspeople, she thought less of strangers. Grandma waved Mrs. Wilcox inside, and she came in, her eyes all over the place. She made for the coffin, stared at the blank white gaze, and then said, "Don't he look natural?" Then she drew up a chair next to the reporter. He'd flinched because he'd had it on good authority that she'd just been let out of an insane asylum. "Warm, ain't it?" she said, straight at him, but looking everywhere. The crowd outside finally dispersed. Mary Ellis and I hung at the edge of the room, too curious to be anywhere else. "If you're here for the long haul," Grandma said to the reporter, "how about a beer?" He looked encouraged, and Grandma left him to Mrs. Wilcox, which was meant as punishment. She came back with 3 of her home brews, cellar cool. She brewed beer to drink herself, but these 3 bottles were to see the reporter through the night. She wouldn't have expected her worst enemy, Effie Wilcox, to drink alcohol in front of a man. In normal circumstances, the family recalls stories about the departed to pass the long night hours. But these circumstances weren't normal, and quite a bit had already been recalled about Shotgun Cheatum anyway. Only a single lamp burned, and as midnight drew on, the Glads drooped in their pitchers. I was wedged in the corner, beginning to doze. Mary Alice was sound asleep on a throw rug. After the second bottle of beer, the reporter lolled. Visions of Shotgun's Civil War glories, no doubt dancing in his head. You could hear the tick of the kitchen clock. Grandma's chin would drop and then jerk back. Mrs. Wilcox had been humming Rock of Ages, but tapered off after "Let Me Hide Myself in Them." Then there was the quietest sound you ever heard, somewhere between a rustle and a whisper, and it brought me around, and I saw Grandma sit forward and cock her head. I blinked to make sure I was awake, and the whole world seemed to listen. Not a leaf trembled outside. But the gauze that hung down over the coffin, the open coffin, twitched. Except for Mary Alice, we all saw it. The reporter sat bolt upright, and Mrs. Wilcox made a little sound, but nothing. Then the gauze rippled as if a hand had passed across it from the other side, and in one place it wrinkled into a wad as if somebody had snagged it. As if a feeble hand had reached up from the coffin depths for one last desperate attempt to live before the dirt was shoveled in. Every hair on my hair stood up. "No," Mrs. Wilcox said, strangling. She pulled back in her chair, and her hair went forward. "No." The reporter had his chair arms in a death grip. "Sweet mother of..." But Grandma rocketed out of her chair. "Whoa, Shotgun," she bellowed. "You'd had your time, boy. You don't get any more." She galloped out of the room faster than I could believe. The reporter was riveted, and Mrs. Wilcox was sinking fast. Quicker than it takes to tell, Grandma was back, and she'd already raised her apron shoulder. Was a 12 gauge shotgun Winchester from behind the wood box. She swung it wildly around the room, skimming Mrs. Wilcox's hat, and took aim at the gauze that draped the yawning coffin. Then she squeezed off around. I thought that sound would bring the house down around us. I couldn't hear right for a week. Grandma roared out, "Rest in peace, you old!" Then she let fly with the other barrel. The reporter came out of the chair and whipped completely in a circle. Beer bottles went everywhere. The straight route to the front door was in Grandma's line of fire, and he didn't have the presence of mind to realize she'd already discharged both barrels. He went out a side window head first, leaving his hat and his notebook behind, which he'd feared more. The living dead or Grandma's aim, he didn't tarry to tell. Mrs. Wilcox was on her feet hollering, "The dead is walking! Mrs. Dowdle's gunning for me!" She cut and ran out the door and into the night. When the screen door snapped to behind her, silence fell. Mary Alice hadn't moved. The first explosion had blasted her awake, but she naturally thought that Grandma had killed her, so she didn't bother to budge. She says the whole experience gave her nightmares for years after. A burned powder haze hung in the room, cutting the smell of shotgun Cheatum. The white gauze was black rags now, and Grandma had blown the lid clear off the coffin. She'd also would have blown out 3 windows in the bay, except they were open. As it was, she'd pitted her woodwork bad and topped the snowball bushes outside. But apart from the scattered shot, she hadn't disfigured shotgun Cheatum any more than he already was. Grandma stood there savoring the silence. Then she turned toward the kitchen with her 12-gauge loose in her hand. "Time you kids was in bed," she said as she trudged past us. Aside from Grandma herself, I was the only one who'd seen her big old snaggly-toothed tomcat streak out of the coffin and over the windowsill when she let fire, and I suppose she'd seen him climb in, which gave her ideas. It was the cat sitting smug on shotgun Cheatum's breathless chest, who'd batted away the gauze in a way that cat will. And he sure lit out of there when he'd come out the way he came when Grandma fired just over his ragged ears, and he'd probably used up 8 lives already. The cat in the coffin gave Mrs. Dowdle her chance. She didn't seem to have time for Effie Wilcox, whose tongue flapped at both ends, and she had even less time for newspaper reporters who think your business is theirs. Courtesy of the cat, she'd fired around, so to speak, in the direction of the beach. Though she didn't gloat, she looked satisfied. It certainly fleshed out her reputation and gave people new reason to leave her in peace. The story of Shotgun Cheatum's last night above ground kept the Coffee Pot Cafe fully engaged for the rest of our visit that summer. It was a story that grew in the telling in one of those little towns where there was always time to ponder all of the different kinds of truth. Good evening.